Great. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll just begin with a little introduction. My name is Samega Asthana, and I am talking on behalf of PanPrep and on behalf of PanPrep at the Cyrus Poonawalla Center at PHFI IPHS Public Health Science University, the Asia Center for Health Security, Dakshin, the Global South Center for Excellence, and the Center for Transformational Health Law at O'Neill, Georgetown University. I welcome you all to today's webinar titled Balancing Pathogen Sharing, Equity and Global Health Security, Diverse Perspectives on Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing System under the Pandemic Agreement. We extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, Professor Suri Moon, Professor Sam Halabi, Dr. Viroj, Ms. Colleen, and then our discussants, Mr. Kashish Aneja, Dr. Monica Kocher, and Ms. Mutriana Indriani. Thank you all for joining us and contributing your expertise to this important discussion. We're grateful for our partners. I just named them all for bringing this together. This is really a very collaborative initiative. We all were thinking about this, and then we all thought we should have like a wider discussion because this discourse is not getting so mainstream as we thought it would in the public health discourse. So I'd just like to also sincerely thank our participants for joining. Your presence really reflects the growing importance of inclusive and informed discussion on global health governance, especially the pandemic treaty, and for working towards strengthening pandemic preparedness frameworks. As many of you are aware, the WHO Pandemic Agreement adopted at the 78th World Health Assembly presents a significant step in addressing global inequities and pandemic response. And the center of this agreement, this audience doesn't need any introduction to that, is the PABS system, an evolving and much debated mechanism that seeks to ensure timely sharing of pathogen and genomic data, while also enabling equitable access to vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, particularly for low-income countries. However, as negotiations from PABS continue, several important questions remain around implementation, legal frameworks, equity, trust, and the role of different stakeholders. This makes it essential to bring together the diverse perspectives to better understand both the opportunities and the challenges of the system. So today's webinar is precisely trying to do that. It's designed as an interactive, collaborative platform to explore these perspectives spanning global health, legal, negotiator, civil society, global South, Asia Pacific viewpoints. It also marks as the beginning of a broader webinar series that we'll be conducting in coming months before the May deadline on each of these specific themes to give them their due importance and the time that they deserve. Today, we have an excellent line of speakers and discussants, each bringing a very deep expertise and unique insights to this conversation. So we'll begin with an overview of PABS by Professor Suri Moon. This will be followed by the legal perspective by Professor Sam Halabi, and then we'll move to the negotiator perspective by Dr. Viroj. And finally, we'll hear from the civil society MSF perspective from Ms. Colleen. We'll conclude with an open discussion with questions and answers from the audience, and we look forward to hearing from you on the questions. We're also being live streamed on YouTube channel at the IIPH Hyderabad, because we had more number of registrations than we expected, so we had to open it up for live streaming. There will be questions from the YouTube as well that will be important here. Thanks once again for joining, and we're looking forward to a wonderful discussion. What I'll do very briefly is introduce my colleagues, the discussants, and they will then further take up their own section. It's divided as such. I'll just start with my old friend and colleague, Mr. Kashish Aneja. I'll just move to show. That's Kashish, who's leading the initiatives in Asia and supports the Center for Transformational Health Law with his global legal expertise in health law. He was a visiting research scholar at Harvard Law School for Spring 23 and is also a practicing advocate, the Supreme Court of India. His work focuses on issues of law, policy surrounding pandemic preparedness and response, global health security, regulatory frameworks, and the use of law to empower evidence-based public health practices. Thanks, Kashish, for all the heavy lifting with this webinar and just jumping in last minute to help us draw this wonderful line of speakers as well. Next, we have Dr. Monica Kocher joining us as a discussant and the facilitator from Dakshin, Global South Center for Excellence. Dr. Monica Kocher is the advisor health reduction under the Aegis of Research and Innovation Systems for Developing Countries, New Delhi. She's a public health professional with an extensive experience of 25 years in healthcare sector, predominantly within the public health system. Her work focuses on health-related policy analysis, health system strengthening. Oops, remind me to move the slides, please. And the project implementation and resource we're setting. Dr. Monica, thanks so much for bringing in the Global South perspective and partnering to anchor the Global South voices in this webinar. We also have Matriana, who is an Australian Awards PhD scholar and a research officer at the School for Regulation and Global Health Governance, RegNet, where she applies an interdisciplinary approach to investigating health equity and access to vaccines in Global South. Her work focuses on South Asian health governance, pandemic preparedness policy, and ASEAN's engagement with global health multilateralism. Thanks, Matriana, for joining in, and we followed your extensive writing on PABS and look forward to your interventions as well. Quickly moving, I know you all didn't want to hear from me, but from our wonderful speakers. So I'll take you to Professor Suri Moon, who needs no introduction. We all look forward to hearing her thoughts and from her work in the space. Again, Dr. Suri Moon is the co-director of Global Health Center and professor of practice for interdisciplinary program in international relations, political science at the Geneva Graduate Institute of International Development Studies. And my favorite, and been knowing for her work for a very, very long time on global health governance space. She's a known scholar of global health governance and political economy of global health. Her research spans outbreak preparedness, response, innovation, and there's a long list of the work that she's been doing. But we've requested her to give us an overview today on PABS, and she's been tracking that very closely. Without taking further time, I'll give it to Professor Suri to walk you through for an overview of the PABS system before we delve deeper into perspectives from negotiators, civil society, and legal space. Over to you, Professor Moon.
Great, wonderful, Sumaya. Thank you so much, and really for such a generous introduction. Let me get my slides up on the screen, and hopefully you can see them. Can you see them?
Yes, maybe not on the presentation mode, but we see them.
Okay, I've got them. Okay, how about now?
Perfect.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and to all of the organizations for bringing us together at a very, very timely moment to discuss PABS. I have the easiest job, I think, among the speakers because I'm just going to be providing an introduction to what it is. I suspect many of you online are already PABS junkies, so I will move quickly through the introductory material. But for those of you who are not yet, hopefully you will be by the end, because I do think it is a super important and fascinating area actually of global health. So I will speak briefly about what is PABS and what is the PABS Annex, what are the major issues and divisions in the Annex negotiations, and then where are we and where might we be going, and offer you my personal views on this impossible question. So just to begin, what is PABS? It refers to the sharing of samples and genomic sequencing information, and a reminder that when you have a patient who is infected, for example, with pathogen, we often take samples from them, such as blood or tissue. That sample is thrown into a sequencing machine, and you get a bunch of data, genomic data, that can then be used to understand a whole number of important things. It can be used to identify, of course, what is the pathogen. You can track the pathogen transmission and spread. You can track how the pathogen might be evolving and what it might be resistant to in terms of drugs, for example, or vaccines. You can test existing products, diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. And very importantly, you can develop new vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, or VTDs for short, with samples and with data. And of course, the big technological shift that has happened over the last years is that increasingly you can do this just with the data. And data is, of course, much harder to govern than the movement of physical samples or materials as it's being referred to now in the treaty negotiations. So I think it's widely understood that international rapid sharing of both materials and sequencing information does protect public health. It's critically important to detect and get outbreaks under control quickly. But the key question is, will those who share that data and those materials get access to what results, in particular vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, but also other benefits? So why are we in the middle of a negotiation now over this issue? If we take a step back from the pandemic agreement, there are a patchwork of international norms and rules that affect what happens in this area. So informally, you have norms of scientific cooperation where scientists share things with each other, data and materials. We also have at the global level the pandemic influenza preparedness framework that was negotiated now almost 15 years ago. But it only covers one pathogen, and that is influenza samples. And is really struggling still to deal with data, although there has been important progress. Essentially, for all other pathogens, what happens is we have a case-by-case negotiation between parties, between countries and/or private actors for access to materials and potentially also data governed by the Convention on Biological Diversity and its Nagoya Protocol. And of course, the concern is that this type of case-by-case negotiation is too slow and uncertain for a potential pandemic or even any kind of dangerous outbreak. When we look at genomic sequencing data or genomic sequencing information, because this is a relatively new technological development, it's less well governed, I would say. Governance is always struggling to keep up with technological change, and this is no exception. It's not a completely ungoverned zone. So you have policies of digital platforms such as GISAID or GeneBank, INSDC. WHO a few years ago issued guiding principles for pathogen genomic data sharing. So these are forms of soft law, you could say. WHO just last year also issued attributes and principles of genomic data sharing platforms, very, very valuable, but also very much soft law. And in the governance processes of the Convention on Biological Diversity, a fund was recently set up to receive monetary benefits from the sharing of digital sequencing information. It's brand new, so it's very difficult to say how well that will work or whether it will work at all. And of course, most recently, we have the pandemic agreement that was agreed by member states just last year, in which Article 12 focuses specifically on PABS. So I've been talking quite a lot about the access side, but the benefit side is of equal importance. And maybe just a few words about what are potential benefits that can be shared through a PABS system. So what was agreed already in the pandemic agreement in Article 12.6 is that during a pandemic emergency, which would be declared by WHO, you have participating manufacturers would target 20% of their real-time production of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, and that half of that would be donated to WHO, and they would endeavor to reach the remaining 10%, but there's some flexibility based on the features of the manufacturer, and these would be reserved at affordable prices to WHO. Still a lot of open questions on how an affordable price would be determined, but that's probably a topic for another day. You'll notice that what's in Article 12.6 is only addressing a pandemic emergency. And so one of the key questions is, are there benefits that could flow or that should flow at other times? For example, in full peacetime or during an outbreak, for example, which is probably technically still peacetime, but not quite full peace, during a public health emergency of international concern or a FIC. And this is really part of what's being negotiated now during the PABS Annex. And during these other periods, as well as, of course, during a pandemic emergency, the big question is, can any of these other 5 types of benefits also flow? So capacity building and technical assistance, research and development cooperation, facilitating rapid access to products, non-exclusive licenses to developing country manufacturers to expand production, and other forms of technology transfer as mutually agreed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'd like to emphasize this is really the crux of the political bargain in the pandemic agreement, largely between global north and south negotiating camps. I think the divisions are not always so clear cut. It's not always so black and white between north and south, but that's a fair description, I would say, of the politics at this point. So as Sumega already mentioned in her introduction, the pandemic agreement was largely finished, but PABS remains unfinished business. And this is how Health Policy Watch assessed the state of talks. We're approaching the final week with little consensus, and I think that's a pretty fair description of where we are today on the 20th of March. So what are those issues on which countries are divided? What are they grappling with? I think we can group them into 5. So the first relates to access to materials and sequencing information, relates to, for example, laboratories, which labs would get samples, under what conditions, how do we track and govern this question. Secondly, around databases, how to secure benefits from users. I think this is really the crux of it. A lot of negotiations about whether there should be fully open access, whether users need to register, putting unique persistent identifiers on data, lots of questions. But at the heart of it, the question is, how do you actually ensure that those who are using the data actually are contributing to benefits? And should that change based on who the user is? Do we expect more benefits or different kinds of benefits from, let's say, a large pharmaceutical company versus a small academic lab? The second major issue is around benefit sharing. And again, lots of details around this, but I would summarize this as a question around uncertainty. So most likely materials and SI should flow earlier before benefits are likely to flow. And this raises a big question of timing. Because materials and SI will reach users before most benefits start to flow, there's a huge degree of uncertainty on if those benefits will actually materialize, when they will materialize, which benefits will actually materialize, and of course, who will actually receive those benefits. So a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and efforts to try to address that uncertainty, of course, are being made now in terms of, what kinds of contracts or agreements or text in an annex can be put in place to try to reduce that uncertainty. The third major issue that's gotten very little airtime is financing. And essentially, there's some discussion, very preliminary, I would say, around whether the private sector should primarily finance this system. And if they should, how much should they give? When should they give that money? And or should governments finance the system? And this is a pretty fundamental question, but has not really been addressed in depth. The fourth question is around governance. So coming back to this question of uncertainty, what is the appropriate level of certainty and detail that we can secure now, for example, in the annex text, versus later? Are there certain issues that can be kicked to the Conference of the Parties, or to the Secretariat, I should say, to be approved by the Conference of the Parties at a future date once the pandemic agreement enters into force? If, for example, different parties don't live up to their commitments, how can we actually enforce compliance with commitments? Huge questions. And again, these have gotten quite, I think, not quite enough attention just yet. The last issue is kind of the elephant in the room, and it's not being addressed openly in the PABS talks, but for those of you who are following this issue know very well that there have been a series of bilateral memoranda of understanding, or MOUs, agreed between the United States and a number of other countries. There may be, those are the ones that have hit the headlines. What we are hearing is that there are also MOUs between other countries, and in particular, biodiversity-rich developing countries. And those MOUs are seeking guaranteed access to materials and SI. So the key questions that arise are, how will obligations on countries that have entered into these MOUs, how will obligations to share materials and SI bilaterally affect the functioning of the multilateral system? Because, of course, data in particular, let's say if a country that is experiencing an outbreak shares data with the United States under the terms of the MOU, that data is then shared with a company or shared on an open database. It's now openly available to anyone. And that would, of course, undermine some of the negotiations that might need to happen in a multilateral system. The second big question is what benefits will be provided to countries involved in bilateral MOUs from some of the text that I've seen beyond immediate funding for health programs in countries that have made these agreements. It's very, very unclear, and it seems even more uncertain whether products would be provided to whom, when, how many, from companies that receive materials or data through the US government. So lots of big questions still there. So let me come to my conclusions now. Where are we? Where do I think we might be going? We have 6 negotiating days left starting on Monday, and I think it's fair to say the parties remain far apart. I defer to others to comment more on how to bridge these gaps. The issues are highly complex, not only technically, but also legally and politically. And what I've observed over the last 5 years of the pandemic agreement negotiations is that it just takes time for negotiators to digest these issues, to negotiate, and actually to find what is acceptable. And the good news, I think that's the bad news. The good news is, in my view, there has been very significant progress made on some of the most divisive issues since the talks really got going just about 6 months ago. However, I think there's still a lot more that needs to be done. As I mentioned before, 2 key issues, finance and governance, have not yet been addressed. And in my view, these are actually issues that could help to strike a deal that is acceptable to all. Because this is a nice opportunity on YouTube to say to the whole world what I think should happen, I do think that it would make sense for the parties to extend the timeline to take another year to construct a functional and equitable system. I think the risks of closing the talks after the next week or even in the next month, the risks are far outweigh the benefits, the political benefits of closing the deal. That's my personal view, and happy to hear others in the rest of this webinar. Let me use my last 15 seconds to plug an article that Geneva Health Files kindly published from me this week, talking about financing, in particular, how financing could be used to buy technology transfer, which is one of the most difficult issues on which consensus will be quite challenging to achieve in the negotiations. And it's currently behind a paywall. I encourage everyone who doesn't to consider subscribing to Geneva Health Files if you want access, but I will also note the article is supposed to go open access tomorrow. So with that, thank you very much. I really look forward to hearing from my colleagues and from all the participants your views on this really crucial topic for global health governance.
Thank you, Professor Moon. That was quite insightful. And I just want to say at the outset that what you just walked us through is not just a background context. It's the live, unresolved center of global health diplomacy. And I think we need to just take it as it is. I'll briefly pick up on a few of the threads that you laid out and offer some reflections on this from where I'm sitting at PanPrep, PHFI in India, from a national and a global South vantage point. What I hear from you, from the literature and overall, is what I see it as the agreement is effectively frozen in time until the annex is adopted. It just feels like the world celebrated the pandemic agreement last May, leaders made speeches, and yet the mechanism remains completely unwritten. And what I want my audience to take an image of is a vehicle that's celebrated, photographed, but is not yet able to even move. And just on some other points in the databases and digital sequence information, I think that's not really a technical disagreement. It's actually a distributive justice agreement, which is disguised as a technical one. And these obligations kind of pose of questions of who captures value in this modern bioeconomy. What I see it as, the science has progressed, but the legal paths and the legalities, provisions have not just kept the same pace as the science has. And this is time to reflect on that. On the contracts, what you said, Professor Moon, on the PIP frameworks, and we just all want to probably take a note, as you rightly said, a little precautionary and a little cautionary, and just knowing that how PIP has worked, and we know that it works, but then also being very conscious of the fact that it just works for a certain looking at the spectrum of pathogens that the PABS will be looking at and just working with that uncertainty that you alluded to. On the certainty of benefit sharing and timing, and as you rightly said, right, that's the crux of the global bargain right now. And I would speak from where I'm sitting again, is that the countries like us, and I mean, India, of course, is an exception with such manufacturing capacity, but countries in our region largely, and it's clear now that we don't want charity to arrive in an emergency, What we want is technology transfer and then also owning the capacity to develop our own products and have control over our own fate. So that message is quite clear that, the expression of what the expression of equity means in this context. On financing, totally agree. I think I can't agree more, is the most underappreciated aspect in this debate. And that financial paradox of PABS, right? When the system needs to be funded and maintained precisely when the political priority of political urgency of that issue is the lowest. And then we've all gone in our region through those outbreaks one after the other, and I've also seen the trophy when emergency passes. Just last few points in the mandatory versus voluntary divide, and I've been thinking a lot about it and just thinking if some kind of creative instrument can be in place, some hybrid model of what voluntary looks like and what those contributions look like. I strongly feel sometimes what is politically impossible in rules becomes possible when the money is put on table. So let's think of some mechanisms around that and how to make that a reality. And the most discussed one on the US bilateral deals, I think that's what I've been thinking about as we say the elephant in the room. So this is like the elephant inside and outside the negotiating rooms. And we need to be, the countries are still wrestling to understand what those bilateral deals means. It's deeply concerning, and not just because the bilateral deals are inherently challenging to understand, but because PABS is fundamentally a multilateral system in which we're trying to deal, strike some bilateral deals. So for countries in South and Southeast Asia, which have been approached, wrestling with that idea of, whether to wait for what multilateralism brings for them or just go by with what bilateralism is offering right now. I would just like to conclude, like all of us on the webinar today, is that there's a strong temptation to just adopt something, anything that allows for the agreement to enter into force and claim it as a diplomacy victory. I understand that temptation, but as you rightly suggest, probably a timeline and extension would make more sense. Ultimately, adopting, hollow PABS and X in haste would be worse than an extension with a clear mandate. But probably we should just think about how can that extension be more meaningful and not just a delay that we've been seeing over the years. So clear, time-bound targets with more transparency involved has been the calls could be a way forward. And I'll just, thank you for this intervention and just stop with saying that the question now is not whether the world can negotiate a PAP system, but it's about whether there's a political will to negotiate a good one. And right, the multilateralism is alive, but let's see how and what it delivers. Thank you, and I give it to Kashish now for the next section.
Thanks, Sumega. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. The next 15 minutes are going to be about some of the core legal concerns surrounding the ongoing PABS negotiations. And while we cannot even come close to doing justice, explaining and discussing the legalities in this short segment, we hope to give you a flavor of what's going on in our heads as lawyers in this space. And with that, we would lay the ground for a deeper dive into the legalities with a webinar we hope to host in May. I have the great privilege today to introduce Professor Sam Halabi. Professor Halabi is the Betty Jacobs Endowed Professor in Georgetown University's Department of Health Management and Policy, and is the Director of the Center for Transformation Health Law at the O'Neill Institute for National Global Health Law, where we reflect on everything that went down and up during the COVID-19 pandemic and try to restructure global health law. Prior to joining the O'Neill as a director, Professor Halabi served as a Senior Associate Vice President for Health Policy and Ethics in the Colorado State University's Office for the Vice President of Research, and as a professor at the Colorado School of Public Health. I'll pause there on his exemplary bio and dive straight into our discussion. Professor Halabi, welcome to this webinar and thank you for being here. In our discussion today, we will look at the issues Professor Moon raised from a legal lens and follow a more Q&A conversational format. So to begin with, Professor Halabi, could you briefly describe the key legal issues relevant to the ongoing PABS negotiations, and what do you think are the core legal issues that the Global South in particular, especially with a focus on like the Global South or South and Southeast Asia, should be concerned while negotiating next week, which happens to be the last negotiations before the next World Health Assembly? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cash, and let me extend my thanks to Dr. Sumega as well for the invitation to participate in this important conversation, and to Professor Moon, who as always provides a quite comprehensive overview. So I think that I will start with some of the issues that should be prioritized by the countries that stand to, I would say, either lose the most or not receive the most. So the PAB negotiation at its core is a legal bargain, right? So those countries who tend to be the reservoirs for the pathogens with pandemic potential are going to share pathogen materials in exchange for the diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines that would result from the use of that material or that data. The March 9th draft is supposed to operationalize that bargain, but there are, at least from a lawyer's perspective, definitional problems, private law problems, and then interrelationship problems that may ultimately make the agreement quite weak, which I think Professors Moon and Asthana have emphasized. So I want to start with the definitional problem. So if you take a look at pathogen with pandemic potential definitionally, it's supposed to have both the potential for sustained human transmission and to cause a pandemic emergency as defined under the WHO Pandemic Agreement and the revised IHR. It appears that those two pieces are meant to proceed together, right? So you have to have both conditions simultaneously. In practice, many of the pathogens that we're concerned about will not fit that definition, right? So for example, there are diseases with tropical endemic characters that will tend to affect local or regional places and won't necessarily fit the definition of a pathogen with pandemic potential, and that would take them outside of the protection of the annex. Those countries, of course, tend to be the most vulnerable and marginalized, and so it would have the pernicious effect of leaving the vulnerable even more vulnerable under the annex. The definition of PABS material sequence and information, so that is broad and that is good, and I think that's one of the victories Professor Moon identified. So it covers DNA viruses, it covers RNA viruses, proteins, metabolites, etc., but it's still coupled with the pathogen with pandemic potential definition. So that creates a scope problem. If the pathogen trigger is too narrow, both pillars of the system, access and benefit sharing, will fail to activate. And so it would be the interest of the countries that have criticized the content and definitions of the agreement to have a definitional clause that includes pathogens with epidemic potential and for the utilization of any PABS material. And I think Professor Min did a very good job of highlighting the importance of that definitional concern. I would say that there's also a concern with the use of the word simultaneously in the draft annex. So it states that all elements of the PABS system shall come into operation simultaneously. So it's supposed to prevent the access pillar from proceeding without the benefits pillar. But the reality is that if you read the agreement carefully, everything that is meant to be kicked to the cop, all of the definitional terms in the standard material transfer agreements are ultimately left for later. So there is a very strong structural possibility that you will have operationally the access pieces of the annex while the benefits pieces slowly materialize. And if that happens, then those core sharing mechanisms ultimately won't help the people that they are supposed to help. So I think one of the changes that could be made is that, countries that have criticized the agreement, like Pakistan, like Namibia, like Tanzania, could insist on mandatory minimum content requirements for those deferred instruments to make sure that they aren't left behind. One of the problems that we've seen in the pandemic influenza preparedness framework is this idea of binding versus voluntary obligations, right? And so if you read the annex, Section C requires monetary contributions and a commitment to at least 2 of the 5 options, and at least 1 of 4 options. Those are framed as mandatory elements of WHO PABS contracts, but the type chosen is up to the manufacturer. In the PIP framework context, we've seen them choose the least burdensome options. So it seems like in that context as well, those who believe the agreement can be improved should insist on mandatory floor obligations rather than menu items. I would say fourth is the issue of traceability, and Professor Moon did a very good job of highlighting this. Supposedly, you're supposed to be able to track the use of the PABS material and associated information, but there's functionally a break in the agreement where it becomes less traceable. And that is a solvable problem, right? We can use universal persistent identifiers to make sure that we are tracing how that material and associated information is used to the specific sort of benefit that emerges. And then finally, I would say, so far as issues for the traditionally marginalized in this context is sovereignty over biological resources. So the scope and objective of the draft acknowledges that the sovereign rights of states over their biological resources. But Section 2A requires that parties align national access and benefit sharing measures so that measures contrary to, inconsistent with, or duplicative of the PABS Annex will not apply once the system is operational. It's a quite comprehensive displacement of national law, and it requires the subordination of national ABS frameworks, some of which are very strong. And in that case, you would render the benefits of the PABS Annex asymmetric. It would deliver weak benefits for the countries that need strong benefits, while also privileging the rights of manufacturers largely based in the West.
Thanks, Sam. That's extremely helpful. Specifically on the traceability, given the fact that in the latest draft, there's an absence of a mandatory registration requirement, or rather any registration as such. I think traceability as such holds much more importance, and the language around the overall where applicable language weakens the entire UPI obligation. On that, I'll move to my second question. The PABS system, as Professor Moon also mentioned, does not function in silos, and it will not function in silos, and it rather exists within a complex web of the ABS mechanism in both the international and the domestic space, right from the Convention on Biological Diversity to its Nagoya Protocol to the PIP framework to over 140 domestic ABS legislation. So how does the PABS system supposed to interact with these existing frameworks, and are we really building on them, or are we departing from them?
Yeah, no, it's a really important question, and there has always been a presumption that the annex will functionally serve as an Article 4.4 specialized international instrument under Nagoya. And technically speaking, the annex doesn't formally depart from the Convention on Biological Diversity or Nagoya, but it does structurally displace it for covered PABS materials. So the Nagoya Protocol operates through a bilateral ABS model, right? The country providing genetic resources negotiates directly with the user, granting prior informed consent and agreeing to mutually agreed terms. The PABS system replaces that with a multilateral WHO-administered system where WHO enters into the contracts on behalf of the collective, and individual countries providing the pathogen materials don't separately negotiate with the manufacturers. So that is an innovation and potentially a very helpful one, but it's also a significant legal drawback or tension. So the Nagoya Protocol applies to genetic resources under the CBD, and pathogens have historically been considered to fall within that definition. That was contested sort of initially, but I think all countries have more or less acquiesced to that fact. The critical unresolved question is sequencing, right? So what happens during the period between a PABS material being shared and the PABS system being fully operational? So the draft simultaneity principle, going back to what I said initially, addresses that retrospective prospectively, but the preemption clause requiring countries to align national measures takes effect upon entry into operation of all elements. If deferred instruments are not finalized quickly, countries could find themselves in a legal gap where national ABS measures are expected to be suspended, but the multilateral alternative is not yet functional. Additionally, there's the digital sequence information under the CBD, and that remains unresolved at the international level. So the CBD COP15 and COP16 established a multilateral mechanism for DSI benefit sharing, but its relationship to PABS sequence information isn't clarified in the current draft. So a single pathogen upload could theoretically be subject both to the DSI mechanism and the PABS annex, creating legal uncertainty for both uploading laboratories and downstream users. And then I would also add sort of the relation to the pandemic influenza framework. Really, I'm not sure that I need to add much more than what Professor Moon noted about this. The PIP framework isn't really addressed. The relationship between them isn't really addressed. And so it would be a key inconsistency, especially as influenza remains one of the most threatening pandemic pathogens.
Thanks, Sam. That reminds me of Criminal Law 101, where we aim to avoid double jeopardy. And I think in this context, if we avoid double jeopardy, we'll be able to build better trust over the PAB system and ensure a more predictable and an accountable framework. And that leads me to my third question today, which is on enforcement, another elephant in the room. So given the lack of strong enforcement in global health law as such, and the lack of authority that WHO has in comparison to, for example, WTO, what mechanisms could realistically ensure the compliance with the PABS obligations under the annex, and what's being done right now about it?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And again, Professor Moon, I think, really sort of anticipated this problem. And if you carefully read, as I think almost everybody on this panel has, analysis of WHO and IHR strengths and weaknesses in the lead up to and the response to the pandemic, nearly all of them identify its lack of enforcement as being a critical weakness. And so everybody has long known that this is something that needs to be addressed. So the current draft provides essentially three components of enforcement. So for laboratories and databases within the laboratory network, WHO can suspend or revoke recognition upon a finding of noncompliance by the Director General and after review and possible consultation with the PABS advisory group. For participating manufacturers, noncompliance with WHO PABS contracts is to be, quote, addressed in accordance with the relevant terms of those contracts, meaning enforcement is contractual rather than treaty-based and depends entirely on what the model contracts contain. And if you've analyzed, for example, the pandemic influenza preparedness framework, SMTAs, those weaknesses are glaring. The Director General has to report to the COP on allegations of noncompliance. For states parties, there is no explicit enforcement mechanism beyond the general dispute settlement and compliance provisions of the main pandemic agreement, which, again, in turn, are quite weak. So to talk a little bit more specifically about the contracts, right? The most realistic near-term enforcement pathway is through the WHO PABS contracts. They're legally binding private law instruments between WHO and manufacturers. Unlike treaty obligations on states, commercial contracts can include things like liquidated damages, audit rights, suspension of access to future PABS materials, reputational consequences, termination and disgorgement of benefits derived from improperly accessed materials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the draft defers the content of those model contracts to the COP, right? And that's going to be, functionally where the most important decisions are made. Because if the model contracts lack teeth, and they have heretofore always lacked effective mechanisms, no audit rights, no liquidated damages, no consequences, then PABS will be just as unenforceable as the pandemic influenza preparedness framework is. And you have a number, again, I think of countries that have pointed out these weaknesses. So Pakistan, Zambia, Tanzania, who call for standardized or at least illustrative contracts before adoptions are legally well-founded. So I think that the smartest move there is for the annex to include these minimal enforcement mechanisms. I think that there's a lot of questions about whether that can actually be realized, but I think that would be the best move, and I think it is consistent with Professor Moon's recommendation that the negotiations essentially be given another year. To be very specific, some of those contractual clauses could be access conditionality, transparency in naming, COP review and graduated response. Some of the more controversial recommendations might be actually linking PABS annex contractual provisions to TRIPS, right? So in essence, if you fail to meet expectations on PABS annex contracts, you would lose the protections of TRIPS. That would be diplomatically and politically difficult, but it would be an effective mechanism. And then, of course, you have national implementation requirements. So Article 12 of the Pandemic Agreement requires states to take measures to ensure that entities in their jurisdiction comply with PABS obligations. So there is room for quite strong national action as well. What can't work is purely voluntary models. I mean, we've seen them. They're very like if you actually think about what might happen during a pandemic influenza episode, it seems very unlikely that the current agreements under the PIP framework would do what we really want them to do.
Sam, that's been incredible. Thank you. I wish we could go on and on with this Q&A, but I think that's for another webinar. And with that, I'll end our legal segment with one last thought. If the PABS system, which we are building today, is not legally certain, it will not be trusted. And if it's not accountable, it will not be fair. And if it's not predictable, it will not be used. And legal instruments as such, by their very nature, especially when they're carefully crafted, they help resolve all of these dilemmas. And with that, I will invite Dr. Monica Kocher, Advisor Health with Dakshin, the Global South Center of Excellence, for the next segment of this webinar. Over to you.
Thanks, Kashish. So let me start by introducing Dr. Viroj. Dr. Viroj is one of the Southeast Asia's most distinguished health policy figures. He is Secretary General of the International Health Policy Program Foundation and Senior Advisor on Global Health to the Thai Ministry of Public Health. He co-founded IHPP in 1998 to strengthen health policy and system research capacity in Thailand. Trained in medicine at Mahidol University, he spent nearly a decade in rural district hospitals in underserved Northeast Thailand before completing a PhD at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, awarded the Woodruff Medal for Outstanding Thesis in 1991 and Edwin Chadwick Medal in 2011. Dr. Viroj was centrally involved in the design of Thailand's landmark 2002 Universal Health Coverage Scheme. He brings to this webinar direct experience in WHO pandemic preparedness negotiations, health system financing, and the translation of global health policy into national implementation. Welcome, Dr. Viroj.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica.
Dr. Viroj,
yes.
I have a very, very important question for you. While we have been talking so much about the technical aspects of the PABS, I would really like to understand, since you have been there in the room, how do you reconcile the push to conclude the IGWG negotiations by next week and finalize the PABS by May, with the need to ensure that the global South perspectives are also meaningfully incorporated there? Over to you, Dr. Viroj.
Thank you, Monica. Very interesting question, and thank you for the invitation. Next week, start Monday at 9 until 11.
Dr. Viroj, you need to be a little louder.
Yes, sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, better than before. Yeah.
Okay. Next week will be the make or break week because it will be the last. The Bureau promised that there will be no extension as proposed by Suri. Even postponed until 1 or 2 years, I don't think we have a marginal benefit from the negotiation. From my assessment, They are the negotiator in the INB process. They are the same negotiator, although some diplomat has changed their position in the Geneva missions. I don't believe another year will yield much. Therefore, next week, we have to conclude the negotiation. Sam proposed that another year, Sam concur with Suri. From my learning and exposing and on ground, sharing the negotiation in INB and ICWIC 4.5 years, I don't think we have marginal benefit. We have to resolve all the bottlenecks. We identify a few. One is the equal footing between access and benefit sharing obligations. Sam has referred to SII Article 4.4 of the Nagoya Protocol. We have a provision of not staggering benefit sharing for those who comply with the PABS system, in particular, the manufacturers. There is a voice from the Global South that we ensure legal certainty for manufacturer for the private sector, but we still ongoing negotiate on the terms and contract of the participating manufacturers, including developer who also manufacture one day, as well as pending negotiation after, if the annex was adopted next 2 months in May, we will continue negotiation on the TOR for virtual network, coordinate network of labs, and term and condition. Continue negotiation on the TOR of the virtual recognized sequence database, on notifying users on the benefit sharing provision obligations. We continue to negotiate the contract for participating manufacturer and commercial user. Continue to discuss and negotiate term and condition on the commercial user, non-commercial user, and TOR of PABS Advisory Committee, which is the governing arm of the PABS Annex. So if we adopt the PABS Annex next 2 months, and pending uncertainty on the negotiation of the outcome of this 4-5 issue, to hold the manufacturer account. Many member states from the Global South said it's quite difficult to explain the parliamentarian to adopt the pandemic agreement, including the annex, which is integral part. It was expected that if the PABS Annex is adopted in May, it will combine with the mother law, which is the agreement, and start signature and ratification process by the national legislative processes. And if 60 member states of the WHO ratify, it start to entry into force according to the provision of the agreement. And then the first COP will trigger. And the first COP will make a decision on the result of ongoing of the ICWIC negotiation. Just the ICWIC continue its work beyond May this year and hand over the findings to the COP to make decision. Therefore, it's so important that Global South is fully represented. But the question is that if it will be fully represented until the MOH or Foreign Affairs Ministry legal treaty department explain the parliamentarian that this is good enough. When we adopt the annex and the PA with the provision of no staggering benefit sharing provision to the manufacturer who comply with the agreement with the provision in the annex, why we have not yet seen the contract with the participating manufacturers, it's difficult to convince the parliament to adopt or to ratify. So this should be and must be resolved next week. This is the most fundamental, maybe the key element of the model contract. Key term should be reflected in the PABS and next week. But I see it's quite difficult as an uphill negotiation. That's why we earmark until noon of Sunday. Whatever we conclude, we'll submit and report to the WHO in May. Over to you at this moment. I think the comment on hollow PABS Annex is unfair comment by civil society who feel that they want everything, but in the negotiation, no one get everything. And the Bureau is not there to make everyone happy. We are there to make a good judgment that the PABS Annex is good enough and can drive and resolve the stark inequity during the COVID pandemic. We are not there to please everyone, and we'll go nowhere. We have to stand firm. What is science? The issue is that we have UPI, and the Bureau did not propose the user registration for which Global South called, but it can be. Some Global South country propose a click wrap, which is a legally binding agreement that the user of sequence information will have to click, yes, I know, yes, I understand legal obligation of benefit sharing if I am a non-commercial user, if I'm a commercial user, if I'm a participating manufacturer, if I'm a developer. So by click wrap will replace the registration stronger than user registration. And the UPI, the usual permanent identifier, UPI, is the key instrument to ensure that the PM, the material, and SI sequence information is a PABS PM SI. So that at the product licensing, WHO EUL approval, if you have used the PABS and the PABS material and sequence information according to the UPI, did you sign? No, I haven't signed. You are out. So these are at the end of the product line, we can enforce the accountability. Now the challenge is on monetary contribution during the peacetime. There are huge pushback from the Global South that during the peacetime there is no market potential, for which I said no. There's a market potential of the diagnostic industry for whatever outbreak. If they are along the line of the pandemic, pathogen with pandemic potential, the least approach for which the COP will decide, then you have liability on the benefit sharing provision. Over to you, Monica.
Absolutely, Dr. Viroj. I completely agree. When so many states sit at a table, we are not there to please everyone. We have to stand firm. And that is really, really important. And so as we conclude your discussion, Dr. Viroj, I would like to leave the audience with one central thought, that health equity cannot remain as an aspiration. It must become deliberate, negotiated outcome. So at the forums like WHO and the processes that shape the pandemic agreement, the choices we make today will define who is protected tomorrow and who is left behind, as you say. So there is also a clear agency before us, and there's a market in the peace times as well. The world cannot afford prolonged negotiations while these vulnerabilities persist. We must move forward with speed, but not at the cost of the fairness. That's true. For the Global South, this is not just about participation, but also about shaping the rules, whether in access to technologies, sharing of benefits, or building resilient health systems. We must move from a model of dependency to one of co-creation, from fragmented responses to collective resilience. So, because in an interconnected world, health security, in my view, is only as strong as its weakest system, And ultimately, the true measures of our success will not be just how quickly we conclude the negotiation, but how fairly, how inclusively, and how sustainably we do so. Thank you so much, Dr. Viraj. Over
One
to you.
small point to add why I push very fast, because the pandemic is lingering around us.
Absolutely.
H5N1, Zika, it stand at your doorstep. If we drag on and on, we lost the opportunity of benefit sharing provision. So that's my position to move this as a public health officer. Thank you.
Completely agree with you, Dr. Viraj. It's just around the corner. It can happen anytime, anywhere. It will strike us. We don't have enough time to keep the negotiations keep moving on and on. We need to bring it to an end somewhere. But yes, equitably, yes, inclusively, yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Viraj. Over to you, Sumiha.
Sorry, thank you. I'll give it to Matriana to take forward to the next session. Thank you, Dr. Viraj.
Yes, thank you so much, Sumega. It's a real pleasure to introduce Ms. Colleen Daniels, Director for the Asia Pacific region at the MS Access campaign. Based in the Asia Pacific region, she brings a frontline civil society perspective from MSF to the PABS negotiations. Colleen's works on access to drugs and vaccines also bring valuable insights from Global South and regional policy discussions and on-the-ground humanitarian context. I believe her work is especially important and powerful in helping us understand how these global frameworks actually play out in practice. So Colleen, we are really glad to have you here today to share MSF perspective. So over to you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me today, and it's been amazing to listen to everyone's interventions so far. Next slide, please. So for some of you who may not know, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, we're a medical humanitarian organization working in over 80 countries. And one of the things that we do is vaccinate people. And we've been doing this through routine vaccination, preventive vaccination campaigns, and in response to disease outbreaks. And sometimes it's us and maybe other humanitarian and non-governmental organizations who are the only providers of, for example, vaccines or bringing diagnostics into our contexts. And this, it could include a variety of different things. It could be security constraints, geographic infrastructural challenges, and sometimes deliberate exclusion. So we provide medical assistance to people affected by conflict epidemics, disasters, or exclusion from healthcare. And I say this because my brief for this was to talk from a civil society perspective, but in fact, it's really, I can't speak for all of civil society because we have such a different context here in MSF. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of our work, we witness how often mechanisms that created for the purpose of global good and solidarity actually failed to deliver on their purpose. So for example, COVAX, voluntary technology transfer initiatives during COVID, which just didn't happen. And they've proved that reliance only on voluntary measures is not sufficient in times of crises and active outbreaks. So for us, the PABS mechanism is something that needs to be able to deliver on the public good. We need to be able to link pathogen access to clear benefit sharing obligations, which can ensure that PABS-derived vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics are allocated, for example, by WHO according to health needs rather than political or reciprocal deals. We believe that this is essential to secure timely, equitable access for populations who are routinely left at the margins of outbreak response, including in humanitarian settings. So one of the things for MSF is we actually see WHO as leading to ensure the implementation of PABS is transparent, accountable, and delivers to those who are in need, rather than fragmented bilateral deals. And PABS is the part of the pandemic agreement that should be considered as a package to reinforce and mutually support other provisions related to technology, to transfer of technology and know-how, attaching access conditions to public funding, allocation, and distribution through the global supply and logistics network. Next slide, please. So we would like to see some of the linking access and benefit sharing via signing the contracts. Governments obviously cannot force the industry strictly, but they should consider a range of concrete policies instead of a general wording to encourage, because this actually doesn't provide any legal certainty. Access to pathogens, materials, and data should be linked with enforceable benefit sharing obligations upfront in a legally binding contract with WHO. This is the only way for us to really ensure that PABS is meaningful and enforceable. And I'll give you the example of Ebola, where Ebola survivors' samples were used to develop new treatments. However, there was no access and benefit sharing principles and agreements to guarantee which are concrete, they weren't concretely embedded and implemented through binding contract obligations from the outset of R&D projects, which resulted in the inability of patients to access life-saving medicines. And, with the Ebola data platform, for example, to address those data sharing challenges, MSF and partners established the Ebola data platform under the Infectious Diseases Data Observatory, which operates a collectively governed data sharing system requiring users to follow data sharing principles, sign a data transfer agreement, and comply with benefit sharing obligations, including restrictions on enforcing or filing intellectual property without committee consent. So these are the types of things that we've seen in the past that didn't work, where we had to sort of step in and come up with our own solutions. Next slide, please. So when it comes to licensing to WHO and WHO-related mechanisms, we think that commitments for non-exclusive licensing to WHO or supported initiatives should be part of the mandatory benefit sharing obligation. No mRNA COVID-19 vaccines developing companies actually granted non-exclusive licenses for these vaccines through either the MPP or CTAP, nor shared proprietary manufacturing technologies and know-how with the WHO mRNA Vaccine Technology Transfer Hub. And this delayed local manufacturing and access to these life-saving vaccines. So it means that when manufacturers want to use PABS, so for example, getting pathogen and data for their product development, they need to commit to licensing WHO or these supported initiatives moving forward. Next slide, please. We need to be able to support a WHO allocation and stockpiling. PABS implementation should be substantively connected to Article 13 of the Pandemic Agreement to enable coordinated stockpiling and equitable allocation of medical products. WHO and partners should prioritize a collectively governed network to distribute and allocate medical products developed through the PABS system agreements between WHO and manufacturers, and should guarantee the availability of VTDs wherever WHO identifies a need for stockpiling or allocation. And allocation criteria should be developed through the PABS, and it needs to be clearly defined and guarantee access for humanitarian actors and address the needs of populations in humanitarian settings. So, for example, in 2021, we attempted to use the humanitarian buffer for a vaccination campaign in northern Syria, but this was delayed for months by complex legal and liability requirements, ultimately forcing us to withdraw its request. The buffer was established only after mass allocation decisions had already been made, and vaccine doses were obtained primarily through ad hoc donations and residual supplies. So this reflects the absence of a coherent strategy from the outset, and we want to be able to prevent that in the future. Next slide, please. So we also want to have transparency across the PABS system because it is a key aspect to ensure accountability of PABS, and it should include enable public access to information of PABS recipients, agreements signed with WHO, regulatory information and allocation. Because our experience during the West Africa Ebola outbreak in 2014 to 2016 and the COVID pandemic showed that in the absence of transparency across the systems, allocation decisions were largely driven by purchasing power rather than public health need. During COVID-19, limited transparency on manufacturing capacity, delivery timelines, and stockpiling further weakened global planning and delayed access for countries facing acute outbreaks. So these are just some of the things that, for us are important to consider. And we know that that the discussions next week come at a time when we also have all these bilateral negotiations, as Suri mentioned earlier, and that's several, between especially the U.S. and African countries. And so we need to be able to have some sort of not allow this to fragment the system and potentially weaken cohesion, for example, within the African group and the group of equity. Group 4 equity, which are two very powerful blocks in this negotiation. From a regional perspective, I mean, here in the Asia Pacific region, we have most of the countries actually belonging to the group of equity. They're demonstrating an aligned position on key access issues, but we must not repeat the mistakes of the past. And we need to ensure a multilateral and legally enforceable framework to allow fair and equitable benefit sharing, including timely, affordable, and sufficient access to resulting medical products. Thank you so much. Next slide. Oh, that's the end. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Colin. That was so insightful. I think what was striking is your emphasis on benefit sharing and transparency. As you said, across COVID-19 and earlier Ebola outbreak, vaccine allocations somewhat tends to follow commercial and geopolitical power rather than actual public health needs. And for Southeast Asia, for ASEAN member states, these challenges have been particularly evident during outbreaks of SARS, avian influenza, COVID-19, and Mpox. Also, I think your point about limited benefit sharing and transparency around manufacturing capacity, delivery timelines, even stockpiling is so important. These gaps don't just affect coordination, they actually delay access for LMIC, especially those facing urgent outbreaks. And this is also something I observe in my own research, including in Southeast Asia, where ASEAN countries varies greatly in population size. So from around 500,000 in Brunei to almost 300 million in Indonesia. And these countries spans the full range of development statuses from low middle income, upper middle income, and high income countries. So across Southeast Asia, countries also navigate very different levels of purchasing power, with some still heavily reliant on external supply. And also, it really brings tension between how governance mechanisms are designed at the global level and how they function in practice, because this is what you mentioned and this is what you witness on the ground, especially in complex crisis settings where MSF operates. And in Southeast Asia, for example, for access to vaccines and drugs, we saw how countries also had to navigate not only global fragmentations and constraints, but also regional dynamics. I think also bilateral trade agreements and uneven vaccine manufacturing and R&D capacities. So what you just said right now really remind us that it is not just about having governance mechanism in place, right? But whether they are responsive, accountable, and grounded in real world conditions. So I think that's where your field perspective is incredibly valuable and powerful. So maybe I can follow up with a couple of quick questions. Yeah, before we open it up, if there is other questions from the audience. So based on MSF experience, do you see a stronger role for regional approaches, especially related to PABS, to improve transparency and more equitable access to medical countermeasures?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, a lot of people have been talking about the shifting geopolitical climate and so on. But I see this as an opportunity. I see this as an opportunity to actually change a power imbalance that we've experienced for so long, and utilizing these platforms to actually do it. I think that in the region, this is the region with the most emerging technologies, the most innovation when it comes to new technologies, and we've seen so much of that over the past years. We should be able to capitalize on that. And so from the regional perspective, I think that we would be able to, where you have a country like Brunei, which has no manufacturing capacity, and then you have the middle income countries who are actually really pushing to improve their manufacturing capacity, for example, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia. We should be able to have something in the region where we can all start relying on each other and create that mechanism, right, to be able to share. And whether or not next week, my fear, and having worked in the UN for many years, my fear is always that when it comes to this last week of negotiations, we end up with something so watered down just to get something passed and through. So in the event that something like that happens, I would hope that here in the region, we would be able to actually develop something utilizing that as a base, but actually developing something that we can actually use. So, where we can bring PABS elements into potentially a regional framework with legal practices and policies, maybe potentially through ASEAN, but that's not enough because, for example, my region geographically, I cover, when I say Asia Pacific, it's everything from Afghanistan to Australia. So it depends on your definition, but finding those platforms where we can actually move that forward. And I think also what COVID showed us is that we cannot rely on the industry. We cannot rely on the market to help us when it comes to the situations we're facing at the moment, particularly because we have so many gaps. MSF, we see so many gaps with diagnostics, with therapeutics and vaccines. Dengue is an example here in the region where now we're seeing more and more dengue, but we just don't have everything we need. And so, we need to be able to think about our priorities and how we can address that, whether or not that comes completely in a PABS system or whether it's something that we have to actually then further move in the region.
Yes, so absolutely. I think we should work together, not just within region, but also with different regions across global North and the global South, especially global South in here. So my next question is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic reshaped priorities for the patent system and our intellectual property regime for the global South? And what long-term changes do you expect, especially in relation to technology transfer and local manufacturing?
Look, everybody is now, it's the new buzzwords, local manufacturing. For me, technology transfer, we're actually just doing 2 analyses around technology transfer where we're looking at tech transfer for diagnostics and vaccines. So I hope I'll be able to share that later this year. But technology transfer needs to be something that we actually coherently and work on, because if we don't do that, we're not going to build capacities in the regions. You know, I mean, there's a technology transfer that's just happened with a Korean company to a company in Nigeria, for example, to manufacture diagnostics. And I think that's more of the type of technology transfer we need to be able to see, particularly for us as MSF, where we do see some, you know, these gaps that I mentioned. So the technology transfer becomes something critical and important. And from COVID, it showed us that they will not do it. Industry will not do it because they're all about profit. So we need PABS, we need these legal mechanisms to ensure that it happens. You know, and in terms of the local production, I'm a big fan of local production. My only fear is that you create micro markets that cannot do it at scale at the price that we need. You know, I mean, that's the only issue I have with that. We've had examples of, for example, the Men-Afri-Vac, which came out, I don't know, 20 something years ago. And that one, you know, was developed in record time. It was a collaboration of a public-private partnership together with WHO and others. And it actually, and ministers of health in Africa said, we can only afford to pay 50 cents per dose. Guess what? It was at 50 cents per dose. And it changed the trajectory of meningitis in the region. So we know it can be done. We just need to enforce it, because what we've seen in the past, particularly during COVID, is that people will not do it unless they can see a profit. And quite frankly, global public health should not be profit driven.
Yes, thank you so much, Colin, for those insightful remarks. And also, I'm very excited to learn from your work. So I think that gives us a lot of reflection to work on, and especially around transparency, benefit sharing, and how these systems work in practice. Now I will hand over to Sumega. I think she gave me some sign signals to take us through to the Q&A. So over to you.
Thank you, Matriana. Thank you, Corinne. This is really an exciting discussion. I'm really enjoying it, and I'm sure our audience is. I just want to open up for questions, but till we source more questions to respond from the speakers, I also want to give it back to speakers with different perspectives popping up. If you want to take a minute or two each to reflect back, any disagreements, anything you want to get back on, whoever wants to go first. We don't necessarily need to go in that order, but anyone who wants to reflect on the differing opinions in the room.
Could I ask a question to Kunviraj, please? It was interesting when you said we can't get everything we want. And I'm wondering, what do you think we can get next week? Or is that...
ensure the benefit sharing provision is strong enough and bring some keywords in the term of contract between participating manufacturers and the WHO into the annex itself. Don't leave it free flow, and adopt by the COP, because the annex and the PA, the matter of law, will be adopted very soon. Therefore, the parliamentarian should ensure that when state party has obligation to timely sharing the pathogen with protection, including the sequence information, then reciprocally on the equal footing, those who use for commercial and non-commercial benefit, they have an obligation. We cannot leave the contract being developed later after the adoption to be adopted by the COP. So this is a big gap. I think this is the ultimatum that the Global South, the Group for Equity, and the African group should fight for. And they are proposing that during the last 10 days, we have a confessional session between the key actors, the BRIC plus, the EU and G6 plus, the key actor like China, Russia, the African group, Emerald group, Southeast Asia, and Western Pacific group. I keep my finger crossed, Colleen, that we get something meaningful to rectify the inequity. It's strange that Sam said it is a private law contractual agreement between WHO and the private entities. It's not an agreement between state party and the WHO. But private law is also legally enforceable, as said by Sam.
Thank you. This is getting more excited. Professor Sam, Professor Suri, would you like to respond to that, or just share any additional insights in response to what's emerging?
Only to say that there are additional legal idiosyncrasies. Certainly in the United States, this is true, but the principles that apply would, I think, apply in many other jurisdictions. That when the counterparty is an international organization with a number of sovereign immunities, it will raise additional complications in addition to the vagueness of the current suggested forms. So you know, in good faith, I've articulated and recommended some minimal terms that I think that would go further, but that wouldn't be the end of this story for sure. But I'm hopeful, as is Dr. Viraj, although it's, you know, reasonable minds can differ on whether or not an additional year should be taken or not.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity. I tremendously respect, Dr. Viraj, your assessment of you know, where the different parties are. Of course, you are in the room, and the rest of us are outside the room largely. And in terms of whether parties will shift, I mean, we'll have to see this week. One of the reasons why I argued for taking more time is because I do think that technology transfer is one of the most important benefits, and that I don't see in the text, and this is not necessarily a comment on the Bureau's text, but I don't see parties coming together to agree on more reliable technology transfer in law. And so the argument that I've made in the article that I flashed on the screen is that if countries are serious about tech transfer, and I do think countries are, I mean, Dr. Sumega mentioned this earlier, this push for health sovereignty, right? We haven't been talking yet in this webinar about the multiple wars that are raging, the increased feeling of insecurity. I was just looking this morning at the news that Canada has slashed, again, its foreign aid budget and has increased its defense budget. And of course, many other countries are doing the same. So in that context, it's very logical that countries want to increase their self-reliance and not count on others and doubt whether the multilateral system will actually deliver the doses that are needed in the event of a worldwide crisis. I hope it can, and I hope the world will look better in the next pandemic. But I do think tech transfer is really essential. And so how do we get there? I think it will require time. And I think money is a possible route to get there. And I think because it has not been discussed, that's one of the things that requires time. I also agree with you, Dr. Viraj, that I think there is a lot of progress actually in the Bureau's text. I disagree that it's hollow, and I know it has been heavily critiqued. I understand the reasons for discontent and concern, which largely have to do with the still very uncertain nature of the benefits. But I do think giving countries the option, for example, to put their data into registration required databases, which is in the current Bureau's text, is a very important compromise. And it's a sign of how countries have moved. Whereas, you know, even just 2 months ago, that was not, there was not agreement on that. We'll see if countries agree on that this week. But I think on issues on which there has been deep division, we have seen countries moving forward. And given time, my hope is that countries could continue to move forward. But I defer to those in the room and the leadership that will determine, where we are a week from now.
And I just want, if I could add just one thought, and that is to really re-emphasize the point that Colleen mentioned. It doesn't do any good to have state-of-the-art GMP facilities in places where they have not traditionally flourished if there is not a market to sustain them. And that is it's not a legal problem. It is a market problem, and it is a planning problem. And I think I and Colleen, probably others, worry that, the invisible hand won't solve that problem. There actually does need to be sort of intentionality and planning, probably at the regional or international level.
I've been taught to observe silence to see how the discussion emerges. So I was trying to practice that, but we are almost at time, and I am in no capacity to have the ability to summarize or conclude of what's been going on. But can say that there are very, very interesting positions, and what I see is like a clear pattern of who's coming from where and what kind of position we put on and what value systems we're bringing on, the practicality of these issues and the idealistic ambitions and so on. So that's a great match. All I can say is that let's see, just a week away, what emerges, and we're all desperately waiting to hear what shape and form it takes. But I just want to thank you all for this very insightful, very timely discussion from your very busy schedules, joining in at this last minute arrangement. I would also like to just thank the co-host for stepping up to the occasion and just getting the wonderful line of speakers from extremely diverse perspectives, and we saw it coming here as well. And today's discussion not just highlighted the complexity, but also underscored the importance of an exclusive interdisciplinary dialogue, even to understand the positions that we're coming from and what makes us say the things that we're saying. We hope to foster a sustained community of practice and dialogue around these issues, around pandemic preparedness largely, and the global health security. And we look forward to your continued participation in the upcoming deliberations. Thank you all once again for joining us, and we hope to see you in the next series, and we'll be sharing more information soon. If there are any questions that are left unanswered, please leave them on YouTube, and we'll get back and hope to engage sooner again. Thanks to you all again.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.